Thank you for coming to this year's Tridion Expert Summit. I'm really glad that I get to talk to you about this topic that is really close to me, spa or pool. How do we immerse Tridion sites into the JavaScript landscape? I'm hoping that you're in the mood for a lot of talk about JavaScript and a few jokes and puns along the way. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Frank Taylor. I'm a Principal Solutions Consultant at Accelerate, and I've kind of specialized in front-end development for content management systems because that's what I've been doing for about the last 12 years. And not only am I someone who's been dedicating my professional career to that, I also have an unhealthy attraction to writing about Tridion and JavaScript and single-page applications and content management and Node.js and Tridion and server-side and client-side and JavaScript again. So I've devoted a lot of words to talking about single-page applications, which is why I'm really excited about having this discussion today. So the first thing that I'd like to do is lay out some goals for this talk. The first thing I want to do is answer a basic question of what is a spa for? I know that you may have some ideas of what you think it's for, but I think it's best if we lay down some ground rules for the actual function and purpose of a single-page application, because then that'll help drive our thought process as how we evaluate them, use them, incorporate them, and then think back on the overall architecture that involves a single-page application. So once we've answered that question of what's a spa for, we're going to talk about the different ways that you can implement a single-page application. There's not just one way. There's quite a few. So we've got a whole menu of different approaches we can use. And then we're going to deliberate a little bit. We're going to talk about the pros of using single-page applications and the cons. And once we've gone through the pros and cons, what I want to do is then encourage you to use a solution-oriented mindset with JavaScript. It's not just about picking a single-page application and then going and doing it. It's about thinking about how a single-page application can uniquely solve a problem that you have. So let's get to that first question here of what is a single-page application for? I know that seems like a simple question, but it may not be as simple as we think. So first of all, let's talk about what a single-page application is. And I know that SPA stands for single-page application, but that's an easy one. Let's talk about what it actually does for us. Well, it uses HTML, a single HTML file, and then quite a bit of JavaScript. And that JavaScript is going to do four things. It's going to get content, it's going to render content, it's going to route users to content, and then it's going to react to how a user interacts with content. So you may notice a theme there, that a single-page application is using a whole lot of JavaScript for doing things with content, getting, rendering, routing, and reacting to content. And that means that we need to ask another question, which is, why should we use a single-page application? And I hate to break it to you, but you shouldn't. Unless you have highly interactive content, you want a web experience in a single language, and usually you want a web experience in a single language because you want a progressive web experience, which means being able to convert a web app into a mobile app, into a native app that could live in iOS and Android and be an installable desktop client. So why should we use a SPA? We really shouldn't, but there might be some reasons that we should. So once we have that basic understanding that, well, a SPA is a single HTML file with a whole lot of JavaScript that does stuff with content, and we shouldn't use a SPA unless we really have highly interactive content, well, let's get into this one key mindset that it's always okay to not use a spa. Just because everyone else is doing it, that doesn't mean that you have to do it too. Let's not give in to peer pressure, kids. So, okay, we've talked about what a single page application is and what it does and what it's for. It's about the content, but we're hungry. We're hungry for single page applications. So let's enumerate. Let's go down the list of the different ways that we can implement a single page application. Turns out there's a whole menu of different ways we can implement spas with a content management system. There's not just one approach here. So let's talk through those different approaches. We've got on the menu the one and only. We've got the sandwich, the salad, the royale with cheese, and the cheeseburger, but hold the cheese. So if you're ready, let's dive into, first of all, the one and only, the one true spa. When you have the one true single page application, the whole website is going to be that single HTML file. The routing, which is going to page URLs, that's going to be handled by the JavaScript. And you're going to have a plan for how those links are going to get resolved before you get to the browser. So you're going to need something to figure out how component linking works. But then your JavaScript is going to handle getting the content, rendering it, and reacting to how a user is interacting. And the big thing here is that the user has the entire experience loaded into their browser. So that one HTML file and then all the JavaScript and everything else that the JavaScript is getting, that's all coming into the browser. So we've also got the spa sandwich. This is a case where your website could be one or many pages. Usually it's many pages. And the header and the footer of those pages, those are static. Those are already there on the server in the HTML. So the users requested the page and they're getting a footer and a header. So they're getting some amount of the brand experience. Especially when you go the route of rendering individual pages, that means that routing is really easy because you mostly don't need it because the actual pages have been rendered. But what you do need still is some sort of link resolution that's living somewhere to make sure that a component on one page knows how to get to a component on another. But at least you have actual pages. And then JavaScript is really taking care of the meat of the sandwich. It's going to render all or most of the items between the header and the footer. So the end result is that the user doesn't have the full experience loaded into the browser. They have the unique part of the experience loaded into the browser. Next up, we've got the spa salad. Now, another term that you might hear for this is the micro front-end architecture. In a case of a micro front-end architecture or like a spa salad, you're going to have most likely multiple HTML files, one representing each page. Routing is going to have to be handled somewhere, but especially in a micro front-end architecture, the goal of the architecture is that each feature of the web page is going to be its own code base. It even has its own team. It could have its own development and deployment process. The browser becomes the one place where all of those meet. So the advantage in going with this approach is that you get very individualistic pieces of the experience that all have their own life cycle, and they all have their own teams and domains and responsibilities. And you're relying on native browser features, something called web components, to know how to go out and fetch the data and then render it in the browser. So the level of spa-ness that we're talking about here can kind of vary from one implementation or even one page to the next. And the good thing about this is that you're able to kind of regulate how much of a spa any given page is. And then what that means is that some pages can load very quickly and some pages could load a little bit slower, but the browser is doing the job of pulling the page together. And then after we have the micro front-end architecture, what we have is the spa royale with cheese. This is your deluxe spa, the one that has all the fancy bells and whistles. Another way that you could describe this, though, is a spa with server-side rendering, SSR, and hydration. What that means is that when the user requests a web page in the browser, what's coming back to them is a fully rendered HTML file. It's going to have the header, it's going to have the footer, it'll have the content in the middle. And then, once a user starts to interact with the site, then hydration happens. Hydration is where JavaScript that was loaded onto the page requests additional data. It requests that data, and now this, what was once a static page, becomes dynamic. So in these cases, the user experience starts being fully rendered on the server, a fully rendered HTML page comes in, and then the user experience takes on responsibility for additional rendering. So this has the advantage of a lighter first page load, and we get quicker time to interact with content. And what we also get in these cases most often is that JavaScript isn't just running in a web browser, but it's also running on a server, because most server-side rendered applications are relying on Node.js in the backend. So JavaScript isn't just living in the browser, it's still living on the server, but it's still JavaScript that's running the show. So a final form of a single page application is the cheeseburger, but hold the cheese. This is a case where you're using a single page application to produce static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, basically static pages. So the whole website is going to be fully rendered HTML pages, be they hundreds or thousands of them. A nice bonus to this is that you're really treating this like just a traditional website where those assets that are shared amongst these different pages can be cached, meaning the CSS and the JavaScript. And another great thing about this is that it's guaranteed to work with Experience Manager, because after all, it's a fully rendered page that's already living on the server. It doesn't even look like a spa to anyone other than the team that built it. And if you're wondering how this could be, well, what's happening is we get these frameworks like Gatsby, which is static React, and what someone is doing is they're writing React, and they're using it to render static HTML. And while Gatsby is the most popular approach, there's other ones like Eleventy, which is more agnostic with how it gets its data. But there's also even Vue.js. Vue.js has server-side rendering options, but you can also use Vue.js to render fully compiled pages. And you even have Angular Universal, which can do something kind of similar to that. So if you're wondering, is this even a spa? Well, you're writing JavaScript, and you've got all of the features that you would see of that JavaScript framework being used, but you don't have any of the interactivity that comes with a single page application. Hence, it's a cheeseburger, but hold the cheese. So, okay. We've gone through the list. We've gone through the different ways that you can implement a single page application. There's not just one, and there's not just two. There's 5 or even more of that. Let's talk about the pros and cons of using a single page application in general. So we've got some things that'll be good. We've got some things that may not be. So let's look at the upsides first. First things first, if you're going to the single page application, it's going to be platform agnostic. You're dealing with JavaScript, and regardless of it running fully in the browser or it being server-side rendered, you're going to be, first of all, if it's in the browser, it absolutely will not matter what your server architecture is. if you're using something that could be a sandwich, that might be an approach where maybe you care if that server architecture is .NET or Java or Node.js, but it's really up to you whether it matters. And it's really only going to be in the server-side rendering approach where you're using hydration. And that approach, again, is the one that we want to think of as that Royale with cheese. That's the one that's going to definitely be dependent on Node.js. But the great thing about Node is that it runs in Linux and it runs on Windows. And if we're going for something where it's just going to be HTML and JavaScript and the browser does all the hard work, really doesn't matter what server it sits on. It could even be a microservice. So it's platform agnostic, and that's great. And that also means that it's a loosely coupled architecture. So if you wanted to change your front end today and keep the CMS the same, you can do that. Another upside is that, well, it's a single code base for the whole web experience, which is kind of nice. In a lot of projects that I've worked on in the past, what we have is a back-end team that writes the .NET or the Java, and we have the front-end team that's writing that HTML and CSS. So two different teams, two different code bases. If you go with a single-page application, it's just one. And what that also means is that it's a single language for the web experience. And that language is JavaScript. Now, secretly, you're still producing HTML and CSS, but JavaScript is kind of the wrapper for that. The other big bonus here is that you get a single development team that goes back to that single code base, that you can have one team with one kind of skill set and they can produce the full experience. Again, no longer that division of back end and front end. And really, I think the most important upside is your portability as a progressive web app. Again, that ability to quickly go from website to web application to desktop app to iOS app to Android app. That is pretty useful, being able to go from that, because the step from React to React Native, it's a pretty small step. So it adds up to, all in all, that we've got a complete web experience that's developed, managed, and deployed in a single language and framework. That's the ultimate upside of using a single-page application. Now let's talk about the downsides. And I will admit that I can be a little bit of a Debbie Downer when it comes to single-page applications, but that's because I've dedicated a lot of words over a lot of years to avoiding the single-page application if it's not necessary. So it might be a little bit intentional that I'm trying to caution you against it. The first big thing is that business logic is either going to be pushed to the back end or it's going to get promoted to the front end. That business logic, if say you're a bank or an airline, those could be some complex rules. And before that was sitting on a server safely in Java or .NET, and now it's got to live in an API somewhere, or it's being ported to the front end. And that opens up vulnerabilities for a front end to be exploited. Let's also keep in mind that JavaScript is part of an IE 77754 standard, or IEEE 754, standard, that amounts to it handles numbers a certain way, and it's not good for doing complex math. So any application that you have, any single-page application where you need to do complex calculations, complex financial work, JavaScript simply isn't the language for that because of how it manages numbers. And that means that you're going to need to push that logic to the back end. So keep that in mind when you're considering a single-page application, that business logic, it's either going into another API or it's going to get up to the front end. You want to make sure that you've accounted for it appropriately. Then there's the poor end user experience. And that all stems from that dependency on JavaScript for rendering content, especially static content. That means a slow time to interaction because you have to run through all that JavaScript. That JavaScript results in CPU stress. browsers aren't what they were 10 years ago. They use a lot of memory, and so we're putting a lot of stress on the CPU through JavaScript, and that results in poor browser performance. And then, because again, we're relying on JavaScript for going to different pages, we get routing fallibility. We have to make sure that JavaScript knows how to get the user to the right page. And then another issue that's stemming from JavaScript is the NPM ecosystem, Node Package Manager, which is the library management tool for Node.js. NPM has lots of really big important packages like React and Vue and Angular, and they have thousands of nested dependencies. And those dependencies can go 10, 12, even 100 layers deep. And there have been cases where a nested dependency, 10, 20, 30 layers deep, was removed from NPM and it broke builds for a day. So there is fragility in the fact that a single package can be removed and it breaks builds. And there's also that heavy baggage that a typical Node modules folder for a project can take up to 500 megabytes. So a complex application could easily go into sometimes a gigabyte of Node modules. And then moving on from just those downsides, we've got poorly written markup. And this is a big one for me as a front-end developer. I see a lot of div soup where content is nested inside of a div, inside of a div, inside of a div. And that's because the JavaScript templating framework requires a single wrapper for something. And even in frameworks that don't require that, what I still see a lot of is malformed markup. Malformed meaning that it's not using appropriate semantics, it's not using any semantics at all, or it's using incorrect semantics. And the result from that is weak SEO and poor accessibility. So there's a lot of downsides to using a single page application. It doesn't mean your spa is going to have these. It means that you need to think about them. And the big thing, though, the really big thing, is that it's about data-driven development instead of content-driven development. Almost all of these downsides stem from not thinking about the content, but instead thinking about a website as data. Okay, so we talked about that. We talked about some pros and some cons. Let's talk about how we think about solving problems. Let's talk about solution-oriented thinking. So solution-oriented thinking isn't, I found a hammer, so there must be a nail around here. And solution-oriented thinking isn't, hey, I need some way to get through this fence. Couldn't be a gate that I need. It's obviously going to need to be a ladder that goes over. If we're thinking about solutions, we're thinking, maybe I should add a gate. So let's talk about how we approach a solution-oriented mindset in the JavaScript world. This means content centricity, which boils down to define your problems around the content. And what I want you to do is to think about your problems in 3 different domains. Think about content consumption. What problems do the end users have with consuming their content? Then I want you to think about content creation. What problems do content authors have producing that content? And finally, think about presentation. What problems have developers had presenting that content? Define your problems around the content and think about the domains of consumption, creation, and presentation. Now, once you define your problems, I want you to design your solutions for people, but in those same domains. Because after all, people are the ones that are going to be affected by your solutions. So think about content consumption. How is your end user going to interact with static and dynamic content? What kinds of devices are they going to use? Think about how a content author is going to produce content for static sites, personalized sites, authenticated experiences, different kinds of personalized experiences, and native apps. think about how the content authors are going to approach producing that content. And then finally, consider what are your developers going to do to balance the needs of a content author with the needs of a content consumer. Take note, the developer there isn't solving their own problems. The developer is solving the problems of these two other groups, and they're solving those problems for the content. So, okay, let's look at an example here. So we've got a sample site where we've got some content consumer problems where we have a lot of pages, some of them have interactive elements, but it's going to be consumed in web and mobile apps. It's going to involve some pre and post authenticated experiences, and it definitely has to be accessible and search engine optimized. And now we've got some content creator problems of, well, there's quite a few pieces of content. Some of them will be dynamic, but they'll be on pages or parts of pages, and they kind of want to experiment with different layouts and different presentations of the same thing because they're always trying to find out what content consumers are wanting most. And it's going to be in a site where they really need it to be easy to create new pages, but not new navigation systems. So, okay, what does a solution look like? Well, let's go with a spa sandwich. Let's make sure that those real live actual pages have a header and a footer, and that's static, and that's going to live on the server. And let's actually even drop in the non-interactive content onto those pages. So it's a server-side rendered application that's got a header, a footer, and content. And then let's invoke the spa in small regions where we know it needs to be interactive. But then over in the post-authenticated experience, once the user has logged in, let's just go with the static header and footer and make all the middle a single-page application. Well, then what we know that that'll do is help the content creator use Experience Manager for most of the public site. We know that they're not going to have to get developers involved to generate pages anymore. And because they can have a full preview of the page, they can check on accessibility and semantics before publishing. But what that means is that developers are going to need something special. Developers are going to need a public content API and a content model API, because developers may not know the content authoring rules or the content semantics that need to go with it. So developers are going to need a new kind of API. And then, of course, the developers need some sort of JavaScript framework that can do this. I might recommend Vue. That was one example of a solution. It's not the only one. The big thing that I want you to take away from this presentation is that when we look at JavaScript, it can do a lot, and it can do a lot everywhere. It can do a lot on the server, it can do a lot in the browser. We're even seeing JavaScript being run on smart devices as well. We're seeing it all over. There's lots of different ways that we can get our content out there and consumed by someone. The important thing is to think about the problems that you have and to solve for those problems. And make sure that your problems are defined around the content, not the developer needs. So SPA carefully. You can do it. I know you can. So again, I want to remind you that there is more than one way to have a single page application. Whether it's the one true SPA, or it's the sandwich, the salad, the Royale with cheese, or the cheeseburger but all the cheese, you have options. And by the way, those aren't mutually exclusive. You can use those in different forms together. And if I didn't mention it, I've seen all of those used. Those aren't ones that I made up. Those are actual examples that I've seen in the wild with Tridion. And then remember the job of your developer. They're not using this JavaScript to make their lives easier. They're using this to balance the needs of a content consumer and a content author. And do keep in mind that Technology is there to solve existing problems, not create new ones. If you're using a single page application in your Tridion implementation and you're starting to get new problems, it's okay to stop using it and go back to server side. I won't tell. Finally, I'd really like to thank you for listening one more time because you made it all the way to the end, and that's 30 minutes of me talking straight. I wouldn't want to listen to me for that long. So thank you. I want to give some special thanks to some coworkers and colleagues like Dario Opacek, Sean Weber, and Roland Mutz. They were really helpful in sharing their guidance and experiences, and that helped make this presentation better. Thank you so much for watching, and please, by all means, reach out to me if you have any questions about a better way to do a spa. Thanks.